If you have ever read the book of Genesis and paused at chapter 6 verses 1 to 4, you are not alone. Many have stumbled over these few verses, not because they are hard to read, but because they seem to open a doorway into a deeper, more mysterious world, one filled with questions, spiritual tension, and ancient truths that are rarely discussed. What did the writer mean when he spoke of the sons of God and the daughters of men? Who were the Nephilim, and why is their presence on the earth so closely linked to the flood that would follow just a few verses later? These are not trivial questions. They reach into the very heart of how we understand the Bible's story, from creation to judgment and beyond. As the book of Genesis moves from the lineage of Adam in chapter 5 to the flood narrative starting in chapter 6 verse 5, we find this strange and compact passage wedged between them. Just 4 verses, yet they function like a bridge and a warning. Something has gone wrong, deeply wrong. The world is spiraling into chaos, and this short segment hints at one of the causes. It feels ancient, powerful, and unsettling. The wording is deliberate and dense, suggesting truths that are more than historical, they are spiritual. This is the kind of passage that urges a reader to stop and reread, to wonder why something so significant is described so briefly. It demands attention not because of its length, but because of its weight. Genesis 6 verses 1 through 4 is not just strange, it is foundational to understanding what comes next. The flood was not random, it was a response to something. And while human sin had already spread across the earth, something about the union described here, between the sons of God and the daughters of men, provokes a different kind of divine reaction. It is more than human rebellion. It hints at a breakdown between realms, a collapse of boundaries that were never meant to be crossed. These 4 verses have been studied, debated, and prayed over by rabbis, early church fathers, medieval scholars, reformers, and modern theologians alike. And they still leave room for questions. Different readers have tried to explain who the sons of God were. Were they angels descending to earth and transgressing their nature? Were they simply the male descendants of Seth, the line that remained faithful to God, now blending with the ungodly line of Cain? Or were they ancient kings, men who claimed divine titles and used their power to take any women they pleased? Each interpretation carries its own theological weight. Each path opens up a different understanding of what went wrong before the flood, and why God chose to reset creation in such a dramatic way. And while some may be content to accept the mystery without digging deeper, others feel compelled to ask more. What does the rest of Scripture say? What does the Hebrew text suggest? What did ancient readers believe? What makes this passage even more intriguing is its brevity. It does not explain itself. It leaves gaps. It offers no commentary. This silence invites interpretation, but it also demands humility. It forces the reader to search for clues elsewhere, in other passages, in other books, in historical context, and in the language itself. The structure of Genesis makes it clear that this moment is pivotal. It is a hinge between what was and what will be. Something is happening here that alters the course of history. Something that leads not only to judgment, but to the unfolding of a new beginning. The flood is coming, but before it comes, the text stops to tell us this strange story, and that means it matters. As we begin to unpack this ancient mystery together, remember that the goal is not just to uncover strange truths, but to deepen our understanding of God's justice, His holiness, and His desire to protect what is good. Whether the sons of God are angelic beings, human rulers, or descendants of a faithful line, the core message is the same. When boundaries are crossed, when divine order is shattered, when corruption spreads unchecked, judgment becomes necessary. But even in judgment, God's mercy remains. He preserves Noah, He preserves a future, and He preserves the promise of redemption. That promise begins with understanding what went wrong in the first place. And it begins here, in Genesis 6. Are you ready to take the next step? Keep watching, and let the Word guide you through the layers of mystery, history, and spiritual truth that surround this short but powerful passage. And if you find yourself stirred, challenged, or inspired along the way, do not forget to subscribe, give this video a thumbs up, and share your thoughts in the comments. You are part of a long tradition of readers who have dared to ask hard questions of sacred texts. And that journey is just beginning. The phrase, sons of God, in Genesis 6 is not a casual designation, but one deeply rooted in the language and worldview of the ancient Hebrews. In Hebrew, the expression is bene haelohim, a phrase that appears in other parts of Scripture and nearly always refers to heavenly beings, members of the divine council who serve in the presence of the Almighty. This language carries a sense of grandeur and authority, evoking the image of those who stand before God in His heavenly court. When the book of Job opens with a scene where the sons of God present themselves before the Lord, the picture is clearly of celestial beings, not mortals. Job 1 verse 6 and Job 2 verse 1 both use this same Hebrew term, and the context leaves little doubt that these are spiritual entities, distinct from mankind. Psalm 29 verse 1 calls upon the sons of God to ascribe glory and strength to the Lord, again showing a connection to heavenly worshipers rather than earthly rulers. The same is true in Psalm 89 verse 6, which speaks of the assembly of the holy ones, comparing them to the sons of the mighty. In each of these examples, the biblical writers draw on a shared understanding that this term refers to divine beings. This was a worldview that saw heaven as populated with a hierarchy of spiritual servants under the authority of the Creator. In the ancient Near East, similar language appears in other cultures' writings, often referring to the offspring or attendants of high gods in their pantheons. While Israel's faith was distinct and firmly monotheistic, it existed in a world where people understood the idea of divine beings operating under a supreme deity. The Hebrew Scriptures consistently redirect such imagery to acknowledge one true God who reigns over all, while the sons of God serve Him, whether in obedience or, in the case of the rebellious, in defiance. When Genesis 6 uses bene haelohim to describe those who took the daughters of men, the original readers would not have stumbled over the phrase. They would have recognized it as pointing toward the heavenly realm, carrying a weight of mystery and power. Yet the shock comes from what follows, these beings crossing into human life in an intimate, physical way. This is no ordinary interaction between God's messengers and mankind. It is something more personal, more transgressive, and, for many interpreters, more disturbing. The ancient mind would have been attuned to the boundaries between the divine and the mortal, boundaries set by God Himself. The idea that those from the heavenly realm could step into the human story in such a tangible way invites questions about authority, rebellion, and the limits of creation. It forces us to consider the possibility that the spiritual world is not distant and untouchable, but near enough to influence, disrupt, and even corrupt human life. As this understanding of the phrase unfolds, it sets the stage for the next layer of the mystery, the Nephilim, whose presence is tied directly to the union between the sons of God and the daughters of men. This connection deepens the sense of unease, suggesting that the consequences of this union went far beyond personal relationships and into the shaping of history itself. Genesis 6 does not merely introduce the sons of God, but links them to figures known as the Nephilim. The text describes these beings as existing in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came to the daughters of men. They are called mighty men and men of renown, terms that evoke strength, fame, and perhaps fear. Yet the name Nephilim itself has an air of foreboding. In Hebrew, the root NPL can mean to fall or fallen ones, a description that has led to many interpretations, from fallen warriors to offspring of a fallen heavenly race. The Old Testament mentions the Nephilim again in Numbers 13 verse 33, when the Israelite spies report seeing giants in the land, describing themselves as grasshoppers in comparison. Whether or not these later giants were truly the same as those in Genesis, the association is clear. The name Nephilim carried the idea of beings of immense size or power, greater than normal men. Their connection to the sons of God suggests that their existence was the result of something outside the normal order of human reproduction. Ancient traditions outside the Bible also speak of extraordinary beings, born of divine and human unions. In Mesopotamian myths, figures like Gilgamesh are portrayed as part divine, part human, possessing abilities and lifespans beyond ordinary men. Greek legends tell of the demigods, heroes born of gods and mortal women, often renowned for their strength and exploits. While these accounts differ in many ways from the biblical story, the parallels are striking. They reveal that ancient peoples were familiar with the idea of heavenly or divine beings, interacting with humans to produce offspring that stood apart from the rest of humanity. The biblical narrative, however, presents the Nephilim not as noble heroes to be celebrated, but as part of a chain of corruption that led to the judgment of the flood. Their presence seems to symbolize a world where the boundaries of creation had been crossed, where the natural order had been altered in ways that defied God's original design. Whether these giants were physically towering or whether their might lay in authority and violence, their influence on the earth was significant enough to be recorded in the inspired text. By linking the sons of God to the Nephilim, Genesis is not simply recording history, but warning of a spiritual reality when heaven's order is ignored and divine boundaries are crossed. The result is not blessing but chaos. The Nephilim stand as living evidence of a breach between realms, a breach that would accelerate humanity's slide toward destruction. Among ancient Jewish writings outside the biblical canon, one interpretation dominates: the belief that the sons of God in Genesis 6 were angels who left their appointed place to take human wives. Books such as Enoch and Jubilees expand on this idea, describing a group of angels known as Watchers who descended to earth, drawn by the beauty of human women. This act was not simply a violation of God's law, but a deliberate rebellion against the order of heaven. These beings were meant to watch over the earth, to guide and protect, yet they chose to indulge their own desires, crossing a boundary that God had set for their own good and for the good of mankind. The story in Enoch paints a vivid picture: 200 angels descending to Mount Hermon, swearing an oath together to carry out their plan. Their leader, named Shemhaza, is portrayed as reluctant at first, but bound by the oath of the others. The unions that followed produced offspring who were giants, beings of great power and violent tendencies, consuming the labor of men and turning against humanity in destructive ways. Along with these unions came a spreading of forbidden knowledge, arts of war, magic, enchantments, and practices that led to deeper corruption. In this view, the sin of the Watchers was twofold. They abandoned their heavenly calling, and they corrupted the earth with both their offspring and their teachings. This interpretation was widely accepted among Jewish thinkers in the centuries before Christ and can be seen echoed in the New Testament. Jude verses 6 and 7 speak of angels who did not keep their proper domain, but left their own abode, linking their sin to that of Sodom and Gomorrah in terms of going after strange flesh. 2 Peter 2 verse 4 also refers to angels who sinned, being cast into pits of darkness and reserved for judgment. The theological implications of this interpretation are profound. If the sons of God were indeed fallen angels, then Genesis 6 records an act of cosmic rebellion, where the spiritual realm directly interfered with the human realm in a way that altered the course of history. This would mean that the flood was not only a judgment on human wickedness, but also a decisive act of God against rebellious spiritual powers that sought to corrupt His creation. It presents a picture of the world as a battlefield, where the war between good and evil is not confined to human hearts, but played out on a cosmic scale. Not all interpreters have accepted the angelic explanation. Another view, known as the Sethite theory, emerged as a way to understand the sons of God without involving angelic beings. This interpretation identifies the sons of God as the descendants of Seth, the righteous son of Adam, while the daughters of men are seen as the descendants of Cain, the one who murdered his brother Abel. In this reading, Genesis 6 describes a breakdown in the separation between the godly and the ungodly lines, as the Sethites intermarried with the Cainites. This theory gained prominence in early Christian theology, partly because it avoids the idea of angels having physical relations with humans, a concept that many found troubling or inconsistent with the nature of spiritual beings. Proponents of the Sethite view point to places in the Old Testament where sons of God can be understood in a covenantal sense, referring to those who belong to God by faith and obedience. They see the marriages in Genesis 6 as symbolic of compromise, where those who once walked with God allowed themselves to be drawn into the influence of the wicked, leading to moral decay. The strength of this interpretation lies in its focus on the moral and spiritual choices of humanity. It aligns with the broader biblical theme of God's people being called to remain distinct from the world, avoiding alliances that lead to corruption. In this view, the giants or mighty men that resulted could simply be powerful rulers or warriors who arose from these mixed unions, dominating the earth through violence and oppression. However, the Sethite theory must contend with the fact that the phrase bene haelohim consistently refers to heavenly beings in the Old Testament outside this passage. For the Sethite view to hold, Genesis 6 would be the rare, perhaps only, exception to that pattern. Still, it has remained a popular interpretation, especially among those who prefer to see the text as dealing entirely with human history rather than involving supernatural events. By framing the account as a tale of two bloodlines, one faithful, one rebellious, the Sethite theory places the emphasis on human responsibility and the danger of compromise. It serves as a moral warning that when the boundaries between righteousness and wickedness are blurred, the result is a culture ripe for judgment. Whether or not this view captures the full intent of Genesis 6, it reminds us that the decline of a society often begins with the erosion of its commitment to God. When we look beyond the borders of Israel and examine the surrounding civilizations of the ancient Near East and beyond, we find stories that bear striking resemblances to the account in Genesis 6. These parallels do not diminish the uniqueness of the biblical record, but they do help us understand the world in which it was first written and read. Ancient Mesopotamian myths, Greek legends, and even far-off cultural traditions contain accounts of divine or semi-divine beings who cross into the human realm, often taking mortal women and producing extraordinary offspring. In Mesopotamian literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh introduces a king who is described as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. Gilgamesh is portrayed as possessing immense strength and a restless spirit, his adventures filled with encounters with gods and supernatural beings. Though the details differ, the concept of a figure born from a union between a god and a human woman fits closely with the kind of world Genesis 6 describes, a world where such unions were not only imagined but celebrated. Greek mythology teems with similar stories. Zeus, the king of the gods, is said to have taken numerous mortal women, producing heroes like Hercules and Perseus, figures renowned for their strength, courage, and often tragic fates. These demigods were celebrated in Greek culture, immortalized in poetry and song. The biblical account stands in stark contrast, presenting no celebration but rather a warning, framing such unions as part of the corruption that led to God's judgment. Even in distant cultures, such as the myths of the Pacific Islands or the legends of ancient India, we find tales of gods descending to earth, sometimes in human form, to interact with mortals. These stories share a recurring pattern, the blending of the divine and the human producing beings who stand apart from ordinary men. The similarity of these narratives across cultures suggests a shared ancient memory or a common human fascination with the idea of heaven and earth colliding. The biblical text does not borrow its theology from these myths. Instead, it redefines and corrects them. While the surrounding nations often glorified the results of such unions, the scriptures portray them as a breach of God's order, leading to violence, oppression, and the spread of wickedness. By placing this account at the threshold of the flood narrative, the Bible makes it clear that these events were not marks of divine favor, but evidence of a world spiraling toward judgment. This sharp contrast between the biblical account and the myths of the nations reinforces a core truth. Israel's God is utterly distinct from the capricious deities of human imagination. He does not mingle with humanity to satisfy desire, nor does he produce offspring in competition with other gods. Instead, he's the holy creator, who sets boundaries for the good of his creation and acts decisively when those boundaries are crossed. Genesis 6 does not treat the account of the sons of God and the Nephilim as an isolated event. It presents these occurrences as part of a larger and far darker picture, the corruption of all flesh on the earth. The text moves quickly from describing these mysterious unions to God's observation that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. The link between the two is significant. If the angelic interpretation is correct, then the presence of the Nephilim and the spread of forbidden knowledge from the rebellious watchers would have accelerated the moral collapse of humanity. If the Sethite interpretation is correct, then the intermarriage between the godly and the ungodly would have eroded righteousness to the point where almost no one remained faithful. In either case, the world before the flood had become a place of violence, immorality, and spiritual rebellion. The decision to send the flood was not made lightly. The language of Genesis conveys deep grief on God's part. He saw that the earth was filled with violence and corruption, and it grieved him in his heart. This is not the cold judgment of a distant ruler, but the sorrow of a creator watching his creation twist itself into ruin. The flood would not be a mere natural disaster, but a deliberate act of cleansing, a wiping away of the contamination that had spread across the earth. The Nephilim's presence is mentioned again in Genesis 6 verse 4, even after introducing the wickedness of man, as if to underline their significance in the narrative. Their existence, whether physical giants or powerful tyrants, symbolized the unnatural state of the pre-flood world. They were evidence that boundaries between the human and the divine had been crossed, and that the results were destructive. The waters of the flood would erase this generation of mankind, leaving only Noah and his family as survivors. The choice of Noah is significant. He is described as blameless in his generation, a man who walked with God. This description may suggest more than moral uprightness. It could imply that Noah had not been touched by the corruption that had spread through the earth, whether through spiritual compromise or genetic alteration. The judgment of the flood, then, was not simply about punishing sin, but about preserving the integrity of creation itself. It was an act of both justice and mercy, justice against rebellion and mercy toward the generations to come. The New Testament does not ignore the events of Genesis 6. In fact, several passages draw direct connections to them, shedding light on how the earliest Christians understood the identity of the sons of God and the gravity of their actions. In 2 Peter 2 verse 4, the apostle writes that God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them into pits of darkness, committing them to chains until the judgment. This is followed immediately by a reference to the flood, suggesting a link between the sin of these angels and the pre-flood world. Peter places these rebellious beings alongside the wicked generation of Noah's day, emphasizing both their guilt and God's decisive judgment against them. Jude, in verses 6 and 7, speaks of angels who did not keep their own position, but abandoned their proper dwelling. He compares their sin to that of Sodom and Gomorrah, which indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire. This parallel reinforces the idea that the sin of the sons of God involved the transgression of God's created order, particularly in the area of physical union. Jude also notes that these angels are kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the great day of judgment, a detail that aligns closely with the expanded accounts in 1 Enoch. Even in the words of Jesus, there are subtle echoes. In Matthew 24 verse 37, he warns that the days before his return will be like the days of Noah, an age marked by corruption, violence, and perhaps even the same disregard for the boundaries God has set. For the early Christians, these references served as reminders that God's justice is not limited to human rebellion. The spiritual realm is held to account as well. The angels who stepped outside their appointed role faced immediate and severe consequences, just as humanity did in the flood. These New Testament echoes confirm that the events of Genesis 6 were not dismissed as myth or allegory. They were understood as part of real history, carrying real theological weight, and pointing forward to the ultimate judgment when all rebellion, human and angelic, will be brought to an end. The mystery of the sons of God is not a relic of ancient history to be locked away in theological debate. It is a window into the reality of the spiritual war that still shapes our world. Whether one accepts the angelic interpretation or the Sethite theory, the lesson remains the same. There is a constant struggle between the forces that honor God and those that seek to corrupt what He has made. If the sons of God were rebellious angels, then Genesis 6 stands as an early example of the ongoing battle between heavenly powers and the purposes of God. These powers seek to distort, to deceive, and to pull humanity away from obedience. If they were men from the line of Seth, then the story becomes a cautionary tale about the danger of compromise, of blending the sacred with the profane until the distinction is lost. In either reading, the world we live in still bears the marks of this conflict. The New Testament reminds believers that their struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against rulers, authorities, and spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. This unseen battle manifests in temptation, in false teaching, in cultural pressures that blur moral boundaries, and in the subtle erosion of devotion to God. Recognizing the reality behind Genesis 6 helps sharpen our spiritual awareness. It reminds us that the boundaries God sets are not arbitrary. They are for our protection, guarding us from forces that seek to enslave and destroy. It calls for vigilance, for a refusal to be drawn into alliances, practices, or ways of thinking that open the door to corruption. In the ancient world, the union of the sons of God with the daughters of men was a visible sign that the spiritual realm had intruded into human life in a dangerous way. Today, the methods may be less obvious, but the goal is the same: to draw humanity away from God's truth and into a counterfeit version of reality. The account in Genesis is a reminder that this is not a new strategy, and that God's people must remain steadfast, discerning, and rooted in His Word. The identity of the sons of God in Genesis 6 has been a source of wonder, debate, and even division for centuries. Whether one sees them as fallen angels crossing a forbidden line, or as the righteous descendants of Seth compromising with the ungodly line of Cain, the account challenges us to take seriously the spiritual dimensions of human history. It is not a casual aside in the biblical record, but a turning point, one that leads directly to the most sweeping act of judgment in the Old Testament, the flood. Both interpretations force us to reckon with the reality that evil is not always born from the obvious places. Sometimes it comes cloaked in power, beauty, or prestige, tempting humanity to cross boundaries that God has set for our good. Genesis 6 stands as a warning against the allure of compromise, the danger of rebellion, and the devastating consequences of ignoring the Creator's order. The supernatural reading confronts us with the idea that the spiritual world is not silent, that forces both loyal and hostile to God have an interest in the destiny of humanity. It speaks to a reality where the visible and invisible realms interact in ways that shape history. The Sethite reading warns of the more familiar danger of moral erosion, of God's people losing their distinctiveness through small concessions that lead to great downfall. In both cases, the passage points us toward vigilance and faithfulness. It calls us to remember that God's boundaries are not restrictions designed to limit joy, but protections meant to preserve life, truth, and relationship with Him. It invites us to see the whole biblical story as a record of God's persistent love and His determination to restore what has been corrupted. When we read Genesis 6 with humility, we are reminded that we will not have every answer in this life. Mystery is not the enemy of faith. It can be the soil where faith grows deeper. The scriptures leave some questions unresolved, not to frustrate us, but to draw us into closer dependence on God, trusting His wisdom above our own. The truth, whether unsettling or reassuring, has the power to shake the foundations of how we see the world. If we embrace the biblical worldview in all its supernatural richness, we begin to see that our lives are lived on a stage far greater than we imagined, with eternal consequences. And if we accept that God's judgment and mercy are as real today as they were in Noah's day, we will live with a seriousness and hope that can withstand the storms of life. If this journey through one of the most mysterious passages in Scripture has given you new insight or stirred your curiosity, take a moment to share your thoughts. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss future explorations into the deep and challenging truths of the Bible. Like the video to help more people discover it. Leave a comment to share your perspective or questions, and share it with friends and family so they too can join the conversation. Together, we can keep seeking the truth that changes hearts and strengthens faith.